Welcome to Brandon Hall Group's HCMx Radio, the only podcast in the HCM arena that weaves current market research, HR technology, and industry leaders into each episode. Our HCMx Radio host is our Chief Operating Officer and Principal HCM Analyst, Rachel Cook.
Hi, this is Rachel Cook. I'm the COO of Brandon Hall Group and the host of our HCMx Radio podcast. I'd like to warmly welcome Asha Pandey, the founder and chief learning strategist at EI Design. She's joining us today to share her perspectives and insights, particularly on a recent webinar that she and David Wentworth, our principal learning analyst, collaborated on. The webinar was focused on the post-pandemic and trends that are evolving from where we are and how we move ahead effectively within our learning functions. And so we have a lot to talk about today, and it was a great webinar. And so we're going to focus on some key points, particularly around 4 areas that are critical for learning professionals as we move forward in this year and what to expect next. So again, hi Asha, how are you today?
Hi Rachel, good morning. I'm doing well, considering, yeah.
Good morning and good afternoon, and then depending on where you are listening in or joining from, this is our new normal, being able to come together. You're in India, David's in Tampa, Florida. I'm in South Florida, so this is where we are. It's great to be together. And hi, David, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much.
Great, great. And we just collaborated on a podcast, Asha, I would say, in the beginning of the year. So here we are. We're just kind of almost heading into our summer here in the U.S. And it's interesting, kind of where we are right now in our discussion, and kind of talking about the trends and what's happening post-pandemic, and is it truly post-pandemic? Are we out of this pandemic? We're kind of seeing shifts. We're getting better, and then it's kind of like we see the numbers rising. You're experiencing that in India. So, what's happening in our world, and then what's happening in our workplace, especially for learning professionals? What are some of the things that you see that are, first of all, what kind of impacts do you see right now, and how is that affecting of us going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Richard, these are uncertain times for sure. But I think now that we've been living in the shadow of pandemic for a little over a year, there are a few things which are emerging as that they are fairly certainly are going to be there, whether we look at this year or the year ahead. Clearly, the way it has redefined the workplace dynamics, we're going to see probably a hybrid mode. Maybe the percentage of remote learners and the percentage of people actually working from office, well, that may change. But what's not going to change is the fact that digital learning will continue to be a significant way to deliver your trainings, right? And given the fact that the changes are still happening, as rightly said, you guys cleared the second or the third wave, we are in the middle of the second wave, and so on and so forth. I think to use that cliche that the change is going to be the only constant also means that the sustainable approach that the L&D teams need to adopt becomes a very important aspect of the planning as we look ahead into the balance part of the year, and definitely into 2022 as well. So this is how I see it, that while we may not be in the post-pandemic phase, right? But I think the cues are adequate for us to be certain that some things need to be factored for as we look ahead. David, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, I agree. Our data says the same thing, that as the pendulum made that massive overnight swing from very little remote work, relatively speaking, to almost completely remote work, it will not swing all the way back. This isn't sort of this whole entire pandemic environment is not some sort of bell curve on a chart where it started here, went up to here, and came back and will be the same. There's three things. There's before, there's during, and there's whatever's next. And whatever's next, nobody's really sure what that is yet. So it isn't about coming up with a plan for that some specific endpoint. It's about shifting the way you think about things so that you're prepared for whatever that is, and then however
Yeah.
that also changes, because we do know that that also will change.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's what were some of the takeaways from the webinar and some of the questions that, that really kind of supports our discussion today, especially around the learning professionals. So how do companies make these changes sustainable?
Yeah,
Asha,
absolutely. Yeah. So the way we look at it, to create something which will be sustainable, I think David put it very nicely, that what comes next is also not known, yet you need to plan for it, right? So I think there is one component, which is the learning, which is behind us. So we've seen that during the pandemic, clearly the asks from the remote learners have been dramatically different from the way they used to be in the pre-pandemic area, right? So now this is a constant, which means that this needs to be fed into the way the training deliveries are getting defined, correct? The other piece, which is very noticeable, is the fact that the business has much higher expectations from the training spend, right? Which means that it's the training's ability to tick the TNA's inputs on what the learning outcomes be is not necessarily adequate. Finally, how is it impacting the enterprise goals, strategies, and what is the value it is creating? So that's the second part, which I see is going to be a constant in spite of all the flux that we are seeing. And the third part is that the L&D team's role themselves has changed, right? So change management is going to be an integral part. Constantly upskilling, reskilling learners is not the only focus, it is also applicable for the trainers, right? And given the uncertainty, the approaches now need to be more agile, more iterative. Right? And given the fact that you're going to have so many people still working remotely, and we don't know where the eventual, if I may say, the stable situation would emerge, you need to be ready for whichever way it pans out, right? Hence, the need for a combination of techniques, more multi-pronged approaches, more dynamic approaches are something that are going to be very relevant, right? And like every disruptive change of this nature still throws up an opportunity, right? So where I believe is the fact that as you're recharting the terrain and you're planning ahead, I think a lot of things which were in your list of things to do, but you never got around to doing them, I think this is a great opportunity to factor for them as well.
Yeah, to me, it's this idea that, when it first happened, everything seemed to, obviously the pandemic is a terrible thing. If we localize it internally to learning departments within organizations, the indications were that there's trouble ahead. That budgets were being decreased, or at least, we're planning on not increasing. We saw in our research per learner budgets going down. It was clearly an era of we need to do more with less was upon us, and that's usually a very difficult thing, very challenging. But what's interesting to me is in the conversations I've been having, the interviews, and we even did a pulse survey where we asked a question: do you feel that your learning department has emerged from 2020 stronger? 75% of companies said we actually feel like we've emerged from 2020 stronger than we were previously. And so what we're seeing is there's been this elevation finally of learning within the organization, right? This sort of the strategic profile of learning has raised to getting to the point where we've always wanted it to be. And part of that is that digital transformation acceleration. I've talked about this with a lot of other companies about how learning has to be at the front of the ship during digital transformation. It isn't about sitting back and waiting for the new technologies and processes to come in and figuring out how to use them. Learning is the tool that's going to bring the people along this digital transformation. They're the ones that learning is the group that's going to bring the skills to people, give them what they need. And this environment just really accelerated that. That said, okay, everything's changed. The way people do their job has changed. The core functionality of some people's jobs have changed. How do we address that? That's the learning and development people. So it really has elevated that, and I do think there's a lot of opportunity by thinking more digitally, more virtually. It is very possible to do a lot more with a lot less and still come out with, superior outcomes.
Right. And what I see a lot that gets asked, with all this new learning and new, from, more formal to informal, the biggest challenge we have right now too is how do you measure it effectively? And what are some of your suggestions, Asha, in measurement? Because that's the biggest
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. I get this question very, very often. You know,
The
a lot
ROI.
of people in the L&D domain are still not quite sure about the informal learning and the impact it creates. But just because it's not measured in the more traditional way doesn't mean that it can't be measured, right? So there is a way it can be measured. So that before that, I think maybe just taking a step back. Do you think that the informal learning is an option which you should not, which you don't necessarily factor for in your overall approach? So I think the answer there is an emphatic no. The connect of informal supporting the more formal learning and its ability to be part of the learning in the flow of the work on demand is something which I think now needs to be factored in every organization's training delivery, right? Now, having said that, the measurement, as we see, Rachel, in the classic sense of what LMSs are measuring, not very often do I see the measurement going beyond the number of registrations, completions, assessment scores, right? Few organizations may look at patterns within the learning journeys, right? But not really much is happening beyond that, right? Now, essentially, if we are talking about formal learning measurement, which is fairly easy to do, versus informal learning, I think the focus needs to be that why did we invest on the training in the first place, right? It was supposed to create a value for the learner, right? Whether it was upskilling, reskilling, uh, bringing in better efficiencies, whatever was the learner gain, right? So the overall strategy needs to have, in essence, measures which or an approach which allows you to measure the impact that it created for the learner. But I think the more important part is then what happened after the learner picked up that skill, then what happened, right? So its ability, that learning that was acquired, its ability to impact a certain business KPI or aligning it to something which is mandated for the organization from a strategy or even a tactical level. So I think we need to have basically a measurement framework which addresses both of these. Now, then what happens is that the informal learning is one of the measures which helps you in achieving that goal, the outcome that you set out to achieve, right? So it's not at cross purposes. Just because it can't be measured through a more classic or more basic frameworks, it doesn't mean that it can't be. It doesn't create an impact, nor can it be. It is done in a way that it cannot really be measured. So it is measurable. It's just that you need to change your focus on what you want to measure. And that is really where the answer lies, right?
Yeah. Right. It's very cyclical in that when organizations feel as though they can't adequately measure something, then they won't do it because
They will do it.
if I can't measure it, what's the point of putting the effort in? And so they get themselves stuck in this cycle. They say, well, look, if this particular learning experience, if I can't measure it in completion, or if I can't tell you how many hours somebody spent doing it, I can't measure it. But like you said, Asha, the point is, okay, what's the point of this program in the first place? What are we trying to do?
Yeah.
If you're trying to
Yeah.
get people to be better at
Yeah.
difficult conversations, simply measuring whether or not they sat in a class on difficult conversations doesn't tell you whether they're good at it or not.
It did.
And
Yeah.
so you're actually measuring their performance at that particular skill before and after
Adaptive.
learning intervention. That's how you know. So, and when you start to think like that in that framework that Asha was just describing, what happens in the middle, I don't want to say doesn't matter, but the truth is it becomes this black box of it doesn't matter how that skill is internalized and learned. And what matters is, did the person get it? Do they understand it? And can they do it? And so if you start to think about that and stop thinking about butts and seats and hours and things like that as far as a measurement of how good you're doing from a learning perspective, soon everything becomes measurable and you don't have to worry about those kinds of experiences, and you're able to do a lot more with it.
And you can get a lot of information from anecdotal feedback, based on the experience, and you can tie that into productivity, into engagement, into retention of your workplace. And so when you start to look at those numbers and overall bottom line performance, you can tie that into how that directly relates to the learning experience. And then this truly is a learning journey where you have a very rich and robust learning experience for your workplace. So, we're seeing how this all kind of feeds into each other. And I think that's what's critical, especially when you're looking at measurement and you're looking at how do you define and how do you articulate the impact this all has. I think it's really important to not, we can't say you can't measure it or, you can't track it, but you really have to, and I think it's important for learning professionals to be able to report on, how all the different offerings they have, how they impact their workplace, because that's what the executives want to know, right? That's how they're going to be able to attain that budget for it, right? Or to be able to continue to invest in new initiatives. So I think it's really important for them to have a clear, business case for what they're doing. And some of it may be not as directly defined, X amount of hours, X amount of time, X amount of, outcome, but I think you can still be able to be clear on what you're offering and how this impacts the workplace and their audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I had done another webinar with the e-learning industry, and one of the questions that I had asked that, are you getting asked, and majority of my audience was coming from L&D or training and development, that are you getting asked more often now on the value of the training on that, right? So, and the number was a resounding yes, right? So very clearly people are talking about the same thing. It is that the eventual impact that it creates. And there are many ways to get to that point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the sheer impact actually supporting the formal training with informal training brings to the learning ecosystem as a whole is stupendous. And so we need to educate the LAD teams to just change the perspective. That's all there is to it. And it aligns to what it is actually supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
We mentioned earlier about just doing these changes and making them sustainable, right? The idea of looking forward to, and that what you're just describing there, Asha, is almost at the core of what makes this sustainable. It's the ability to demonstrate the impact that it's actually having is what is going to make this approach sustainable. And the impact is there. We're coming at this not from a position of we don't know if this works, give it a try. This is the approach that we know works regardless of a pandemic environment. All this environment has done has accelerated the need, but it isn't just about these outcomes that we're talking. I mean, the idea of using more informal learning, space learning, allowing for more reinforcement, this is all coming from brain science, neurocognitive science. People, this is how they retain information. This is how they're able to recall information. Works much better than simply having a series of in-person events where you're front-loading people with information that they're going to recall at some later date. So again, this is not simply about how do we survive this pandemic environment, right? This is partly that, but the answer to that question is still the same answer we were after before, is by changing the way we think this, we're going to drive better learning and then in turn drive better outcomes.
Right. And I think it also, Richard, connects back to we've started having conversations with a lot of our customers, which is that how do you create an army of lifelong learners, right? And amongst the first things that emerges is that you need to give the control back to the learner, which means that the learning environment, the learning ecosystem has to support all aspects of what the learners believe is necessary for them to be successful, right? And it will automatically lead you to the success of the goals that the business or the enterprise has, right? And this is what makes it sustainable. And continuous learning organizations are the organizations which are more innovative, more creative, and they are going to be able to sustain the edge that they're required to.
Right, and I think, you know, offering people what they need and what they want to learn has a greater impact and more of a it's more robust and more enriched for the workplace to be able to, you know, really truly choose what they want to learn, because that's what is, you know, that's what really creates that continuous learning, or helps to create that continuous learning journey for the professional, because people don't want to take courses or things that they don't feel is relevant for them or is needed, especially if it gets in the way of them doing their actual job. And I think if you look back in grade school, it's the same thing. You know, some courses or classes you have to take because it's mandated, it's expected, whether it's in elementary school or in college. And I think you see that people that are not interested in certain curriculum just don't really apply it, or they don't, you know, they're not getting the same thing out of it. So I think it's really important and critical where we are right now in the world. And, you know, going back to some of the points you made earlier is, you know, it has to be agile, it has to be meaningful, it has to be realistic to what they need to do their job and to be better or to reskill. Reskill is so important because our jobs are changing, depending on, you know, there's certain roles that are just not here anymore based on what's happening around us. So, you know, I couldn't agree more. And I think, you know, Asha, is there anything else you'd like to end? I know that we're going to give away the ebook for 2021 on learning trends, and you know, following up from our discussion today, people can access that, access our discussion. You know, we just really wanted to kind of expand on your recent webinar and to kind of share and highlight some of the 4 points that came out of that discussion. Is there anything else that you'd like to make sure that you share?
Yeah, for sure. So the ebook that I'm talking about, Trends, was one part of the exercise, which was really the last one, as to when you're applying, which of the trends are meaningful, right? But there's another ebook, which is basically a trilogy, which is, I call it the Elevating the Remote Learning Programs. And it essentially has 3 components. It talks about the planning and strategizing, then the actual creation, and then it talks about the schema of formal and the informal, which is where the components of more sustainable approaches emerge. So definitely it's a trilogy, it's worth downloading and exploring. And certainly the ebook on trends continues to be something that's still as valid and relevant. So there are these 2 options that the people who are listening to us or watching us could find value in.
Great. Thank you, Asha. Thank you, David. It's always a great time getting together, chatting, and you know, we'll be together again soon in the next couple of months on another topic. It'll be interesting to see kind of if, you know, what changes, anything monumental or just kind of small incremental things as we kind of head into the next couple of months here. You know, I do think this year has been more, I feel like it's definitely different than last year. You know, things are not changing as drastically, you know, week by week. So, you know, I feel like things will continue to move in a better direction.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks so much, Rachel. In fact, we've been beneficiary of the impact of the pandemic, right? It's an odd position, but at many levels, we are part of the change, which I think will create a significantly better learning environment in the years to come. So I think we are all aligned to that bet for sure.
Absolutely.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for listening in. And we look forward to your feedback. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to us, to Asha, to David, myself. We're here for you. Stay safe, healthy, and I look forward to our next discussion. Take care.
Thank you.